Trent, thank you so much, and thanks to absolutely everyone here who came out, investors, shareholders, board members, members from the administration, members from Capitol Hill. This is going to be a great night and just the best way to launch KBOS and our partnership with both Second Front as well as Google. But first, before I introduce our panelists here, which we have a stellar panel, let me first say thank you so much to the Cocoon Data team, because without you, we wouldn't be having this excellent celebration. Specifically, Claire Kenyon, Director of Corporate Communications, as well as John Watts, who's Director of Public Sector. So if you work in the public sector, you need to talk to John. But in addition to that, I also want to thank a few people who I see in the crowd tonight, namely Ambassador Arthur Sinodinos, who most recently was the Australian ambassador to the U.S., as well as a colleague of mine, Steve Harrington, who's a shareholder, and a few friends from the administration. Thank you guys so much. So without further ado, let me introduce some of the panelists that'll be joining us today. So firstly, as you referenced, Josh Marcuse, who is not only a dear friend of Cocoon Data, but a dear friend in general. He serves as Director of Strategic Initiatives for Google Public Sector. Is that right? Perfect. And then before that, before he joined Google, Josh was Executive Director of the Defense Innovation Board, which is an organization inside of DoD that implements technology as well as some business practices from Silicon Valley within DoD itself. And before that, had an illustrious career in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, with CSIS, with CNAS, with Booz Allen Hamilton, so very well versed across many different ventures in DC and around the country and the world. Secondly, a man who really needs no introduction, but we're going to give it to him nonetheless, Governor Terry McAuliffe, also a dear friend, fellow Cocoon Data Board Member, 72nd Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He also was chairman of the Democratic National Committee, was chairman of the National Governors Association, where he was voted Cyber Governor of the Year 4 years in a row. And before that, did a bunch of stuff, including co-chairing President Clinton's 1996 campaign, as well as inauguration, as well as serving as chairman of then Senator Hillary Clinton's 2008 presidential campaign. But something really interesting about the governor, for all the Aussies in the room, is that he is an avid fan of rugby. And his son, also Jack, played rugby at the U.S. Naval Academy. So without further ado, I think, Trent, should we turn it over to you for the first topic, and then I can start firing away questions, or should I lay out the topic and we can go from there?
Yeah, look, I think we can get on with the first question. Just for context for those in the room, because I want to be respectful that not everybody here is coming with a full technology hat on. We're talking about two things today. One of them is about the add-on that we're doing for Google, for Google Docs. The other part of it is, you just saw in the videos, an API. APIs connect everything. When you open an app on the phone, it calls the cloud, it makes everything talk together on the internet, and this is a new paradigm in how we're doing things. So when we talk about it tonight, when we're talking about what we're doing in onshore and offshore and all that sort of stuff, it's a new way of securing data around the internet. So that's all. I just wanted to give some context. And and I'm sure along the way, Alex will make sure that if I use any acronyms, because we are here in a city that loves acronyms, right?
So get ready.
Have you seen how many acronyms you do in the federal space, Governor? It's unbelievable. All right, over to you.
Awesome. So we're going to be running through just 3 quick topics tonight. Everyone will get a question or two, and then we will let you guys go back to the libations, cocktails, canapes, and conversation. But first, I'd love to first ask Josh a question. So historically, as we all know, when we think about national security, we've thought about a hardware-based system. In the past 30, 40 years, obviously, we have heavily started moving towards technologies, digital technologies that underpin those different types of hardware. So kind of, Josh, the first question I have for you, could you give us a description of what we constantly hear, especially for the people who are not in the Pentagon, who are not in the room often, of what exactly is a connected battlefield, A? And then secondly, what does it look like, and how are we seeing technologies, be it unmanned systems, undersea, on the surface, in the air, in the form of drones or drone swarms? How are we seeing those being integrated into our defense capability?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And congratulations, Trent. This is a huge night for you. We're all so proud of you. Watched this come from your idea to now it's on screen, and it's awesome. So congratulations. And also, it's kind of crazy to be next to a governor, so I'm going to try not to stammer and stutter. But obviously, I feel like I've upgraded to my panel ticket has been punched, so thank you, Governor. So that's a really big question, but it's something that I feel like we have a lot of armchair experts on what the future of battlefield looks like, because we're all watching it unfold in Ukraine tragically over the last year and a half. And I think that when I think about what we're watching in Ukraine, and you asked about connected battlefield and the role of autonomy in those systems, I always look back at where are the lessons from history that could teach us something about what we're seeing. And one of the analogies that really speaks to me is blitzkrieg warfare during World War II. That was a time when a very formidable industrial power took a bunch of different technologies that had not been combined before, and to the casual observer, put them together in a way that changed warfare. But a really good historian would tell you that it actually wasn't seen for the first time in World War II. The Germans actually tried it out in Spain during the Spanish Civil War in 1937 and 1938. So there were a lot of people in Washington, D.C., in the War Department, who were reminding everyone, you need to pay attention to what the Germans are doing in Spain. That is a glimpse of a very terrifying future of the way these new technologies will be combined, and we have to get ready. That same story is playing out today in Ukraine, where we are watching what is happening in Russia and in Ukraine, and we are seeing a glimpse of what a future battlefield could look like. When we think about the way the Internet of Things has transformed our economy here and the safety of our capital city, that is what the connected battlefield is. It's the Internet of Battlefield Things. And the reason why it's so connected with these notions of software-defined warfare and the digital evolution that you described is the history of warfare is all about the ability for generals and commanders and combatants to communicate with each other and coordinate what they do. And so now that we have this wave of artificial intelligence able to connect all those different things, what we're seeing is, for the first time, that the ability to gather information about what's going on and make sense of it and connect that to some asset on the battlefield that can cause an effect is now happening faster than human cognition. And that, I think, is really the big difference that we're seeing, which is before we were really limited by what human decision speed. And now what we're seeing on that connected battlefield is one in which a lot of processes are going to take place that are going to be, we talk about the observe, orient, decide, act loop, OODA loop. There's going to be a lot of OODA loops that are able to turn. And so I think why this comes back to Cocoon, to tie it back to our conversation tonight, is every step of that process has to be secured. We need to have very strong cybersecurity and very strong control of information to understand and trust that the different things that are all connected on that battlefield are accurate, reliable, that the information is trustable, and that the humans that are in charge of making decisions over all of those systems that are connected can have confidence that it's going to do what it says it's going to do and it hasn't been attacked or spoofed, or that we're not letting people or machines have access to that data that we don't want to.
That's great, thank you. And I think we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into Ukraine in a minute here. But Trent, from a data perspective, how do you respond to what Josh just outlined through the prism of KBOS? Like, how is KBOS going to be applied to these sorts of systems?
Yeah, I think most people don't really realise what happens on the internet, right? I mean, you go onto your browser and you open it up and it's got a padlock. It's a little encrypted session, right, up to a web server. That data you put in there, could be whatever information, is in there for a fraction of a second. Then it lands on a web server and you hope the web company or the application provider keeps it safe. That's it. That was invented in 1996 by Netscape. Okay, that's how old it is. You've got humans out there. We train them for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to go and fly that plane, drive that tank, whatever. We train them to make good decisions in the field. They're not there now in the connected battlefield. They're not there when there's 10,000 drones that are somewhat disposable to a degree, going out there and swarming in to cause an offensive attack. So all those bits of data that go there have to get there somehow, or they have to be preloaded. Now, when you preload encrypted data on drones, we assume we're going to lose drones, but we don't want our enemy to pick that drone up and be able to look at what's on there, because then they know that we know where they are, right? So moving data around is different. What we've looked at is to not rely on those network connections. The military looks at it and says, we are going over untrusted networks in the battlefield now. So in being able to encrypt every little individual blob of data that now goes over untrusted networks, and then the drone has to call back and say, hey, it's me, and presents a credential, and the Pentagon can release a key just for that one little blob of data, but do that over billions of blobs of data on a connected battlefield. You have been the plumbing, the enablement, if you like, of the security posture for that battlefield. So everybody looks at the drones and they look at all the really cool stuff that we all want to look at, but actually to control it, to Josh's point. If you're sitting back here over in the Pentagon, it's in Virginia, isn't it?
You bet it is.
We're all a big
Right there,
control hub.
everything
They didn't
Virginia.
put it in Maryland, did they?
Where?
They didn't put it, right, good. They need to make sure that data going out there.
There are some other things in Maryland where you want to throw some stones.
Yeah, I was trying to get those too.
But you know, it's a really, really serious issue, and we have to make sure that information that's shared around those battlefields is secure and trusted, because the bad guys, they also know if they can put, to Josh's point, poison data in there, they can give targeting information that could be firing back home, right? So it is a changing landscape. You know, you look at what's happening now with the billions and trillions of dollars that have gone into the fleets, like whether it's the Pacific Fleet or others. China's not doing that. They're not out there building, you know, the big fleets in the same way. They're looking at thousands of small vessels, you know, thousands of different things that can go out and attack us in different ways, and our adversaries are changing. They don't have the budgets of the US, so they're going to do it differently, and we're going to have to change too.
Awesome, Trent. Well, Governor, been waiting to ask you this question, but unlike many people in this room, I may be wrong, but you are someone who has been to the front lines in Ukraine during this conflict, during this war. I think you were the first American to actually go to the front lines. So I don't know if you had the chance while you were there. Obviously, you saw the soldiers, the tanks, et cetera. But did you get a sense of the digital battlefield as being present on the front lines?
Yeah, so I went in April of 23. War had basically just started. Reminded me a little bit of World War I, artillery shells going back and forth. But the communication system was totally amiss. And they were not able to talk to the bunkers that were 5 miles away. Lack of ammunition. First bunker I went to, I remember the commander of the unit said, I have 2 missiles left. The next place had 3 RPGs. This was the beginning of the war. So being able to provide them with a tool like Cocoon Data that they can all talk to each other. Different battalions could have keys for certain information on delivery of ammunition, what they needed to do, I think would be invaluable for the Department of Defense and what we need to do in the military-wise. But I would also say, though, where I think the big application is here in the United States of America. So when I got elected governor of Virginia, I went in office, we had just had 3 major cyber attacks, states. Nikki Haley, as the governor of South Carolina, had a massive breach. Millions of pieces of data were stolen. Her constituents were very angry. We had one in Alabama, we had one in Arizona. So when I took office, I quickly said, we've got to figure out how to protect the data of my 9 million Virginia residents. And I was also concerned, you may not know this, but Virginia, when you're elected governor, it's the only state in America that you get the highest level of national security clearance because of 51 military installations, the largest naval base in the world, the Pentagon, CIA, all even SEAL teams and so forth. So I had the added burden in my mind of protecting data because I had to make sure that my military was happy. I had to make sure my citizens was happy. So I embarked on a whole effort on cybersecurity. We became the best state in America for it. Virginia today is the only state in America that we teach cybersecurity beginning in kindergarten. It is core curriculum in our high school. You get a $20,000 grant in Virginia if you will go to our community college. You get a 2-year degree, and then you come work for the state for 4 years. Everything's for free. So we really, and the reason why I recruited a lot of cyber companies to come to Virginia, #1 in the country when I left office. When I left office, I had 42,000 open jobs, and the starting pay was $88,000. So for me, it was economic, jobs for my citizens, protecting the citizens, and also making sure that we could do everything we needed to do with our military. Then I got elected chairman of the national governors, and what I wanted to do was to make sure all 50 states, because you all know this, and all the Google folks who are here, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And I could do a great job in Virginia, but if Idaho was using the same healthcare provider as Virginia, they would get in through Idaho's door and they'd come to Virginia. So if the rest of the states weren't safe, it didn't make any difference. So we embarked on a huge program to make all 50 states. We at the NGA, we paid for it. We went into every state. We gave them an analysis. And so that's why cyber's sort of been in my bones for the last 10 years. But I'm thinking of like and I get asked to go on a lot of boards. I don't do a lot. But when I heard what Cocoon Data was doing, the idea as a governor that you could come in and encrypt my data. And remember, states have more data than the federal government. We have all the state income taxes. We have all the Medicare, Medicaid records. We have all the property tax records. We have all the sales tax records. We have all the state income tax. We have the driver's license. So we have a lot of data that people are constantly trying to steal from us. But if I had something come in where I could encrypt all that data early on, and if I'm trying to study diabetes and why people are heavy in Southwest Virginia, if I want to share with that group of health providers, and because of HIPAA rules, I couldn't show it to other people, this was my answer. So that's why I'm actually pretty excited about this. So I'm ready to go. I'm fired up, ready to go.
And that's not to mention that Governor McAuliffe also unlocked Northern Virginia as the tech corridor it is today, which I think Google's offices are there, and maybe second front's in Virginia as well. Yeah, so clearly that's it.
Any old AWS folks here? Any Amazon folks?
Yeah, Paul is, right?
I did the headquarters and I recruited
raise
AWS
his
to come
hand.
to Northern Virginia. Amazon, the biggest deal in 22 years. We won it here in Virginia. They're not in Maryland. They're right here in Virginia.
All right, guys. Well, now we're going to dig a little bit deeper here, and I think this is where the acronym soup comes from a little bit. But Trent, I'd love to now think about the U.S. DoD supply chain and industrial base. I think what we've talked about pretty frequently is that doesn't just stop at the U.S. border. We also have suppliers from allied countries all over the world, but especially within the Five Eyes and NATO countries. So recently, or I guess in the past few years, I think John Watts will be able to tell me correctly, but DoD has enacted something called CMMC. And I'm going to let you explain exactly the acronym and everything like that. But also just in relation to especially what our Ambassador Sinodinos has worked on so passionately in regards to AUKUS, ITAR is also a major issue in regards to sharing not only intelligence, but some of our most precious crown jewel technologies with our allies, which we need to start doing in order to frankly, combat some of our adversaries in some of these domains. So, Trent, I understand the Pentagon indicated that in January of 2026, they are going to implement CMMC across the entire defense industrial base. Can you just give us a quick overview of, A, what CMMC is for the folks that don't know, also ITAR, and just talk about why that's important to what you're doing at KBOS, specifically with Google.
Yeah, sure, thanks. Cyber maturity model certification. Some would argue it's the biggest change in audit since mandatory financial auditing came in after the stock market crash in the 30s. But basically the bad guys worked out it's easier to hack the supply chain than it is the Pentagon, right? So you go and give one of the big contractors, the Boeings and Lockheeds and all these billion-dollar contract, and they go and sub it out to, 1,000 subcontractors who then sub it out. It's like a tier, right? Right down to a small company. It could be down in Alabama who's got a $100,000 contract. But by January 26, they will all have to comply with the new CMMC regulations about how they handle the Pentagon's sensitive information. Because you put all that together. To your point, Terry, like that's the weakest. You're only as good as your weakest link, right? So this is really important. The problem's been over the last couple of years, how do you roll this out and how do you do it at scale? Because obviously the defence industry in this country is enormous. How do you do it at scale, but also not have a big cost impact? Because not everyone in that supply chain is a Boeing that has the big checkbooks, right? Small, medium enterprise is still the heartbeat of this country. It's the same in Australia. So in what we're doing with the add-on that you just saw with that encryption with Google, one of the things Google realised as well is that's a big market, right? And Google Workspace is a great product. It's easy to use. So by taking our add-on and putting it in there, we're running it in Google's new sort of federal cloud, for lack of a better term. It's called Assured Workloads. But it means by putting our technology inside a Google Doc, you can now, and Google Drive, you can now carry that information, be compliant with CMMC, and importantly, ITAR. So ITAR is the export controls that the US put in after the Second World War to make sure they could control critical technologies to do with defence and not have it exported to, bad places. So it also allows you to comply with that. And the alternative, well, there are not many alternatives at the level we're doing it with Google, and the ones that are there are very, very expensive. Particularly the sort of default one with a company starting with M. So we're going to make sure we can do it a lot cheaper, a lot better at scale, and make sure that our defence industry is compliant. Now, also that's going to apply. And thank you, Mr. Sinodinos, for coming along tonight. We met, of course, a few years ago when you were in the role there. But the Pentagon's come out and said we intend to roll this out. Overseas. I mean, you can imagine the US defence industry crying foul if the inputs from Australia or the UK weren't subject to this, right? So it has to be globally practical solutions. It's got to be not too expensive. And of course, and we're going to get to the AUKUS point, but Australians for the first time will be positioned full time on America's arguably most strategic asset, right? So they've never had foreigners based on board nuclear submarines. So again, this is, if it wasn't a big deal a little while ago with CMMC, it's a really big deal now, right? With what we're about to share between Australia, UK, and the US. So, in what we're doing in federal and government, it's not just about federal and government with Google. It's about broader uplift of security posture, and particularly in sectors where perhaps they hadn't always looked towards Google. But I think with the Google public sector strategy right now of the team, I think people will see what Google are doing, particularly in the public sector space, and in industries like this, is suddenly a really, really strong alternative.
Awesome, Trent. Kind of piggybacking on that, Josh, with both your Defense Innovation Board as well as your current role hat on, is Google positioning itself to be a key partner in regards to secure intelligence sharing, data sharing amongst our allies, be it with the Five Eyes or NATO or potentially even the Quad at a certain point? Is that something that you guys are doing, and if so, how is it going?
Absolutely, it is, and it's something that is sort of core to our corporate ethos. Is all about collaboration and sharing and moving information to where it's needed. And we know that our government customers in the state and local world, and also federal, and also in security, need that, including them, their allies and partners. So that's definitely a focus for us. One of the things I like to say, when you think about the complexity of dealing with CMMC and changing regulations or ITAR regulations, is really a broader trend. If you step back to think about, during the 1950s, Lockheed Martin and the Defense Industrial Base, Kelly Johnson Skunk Works, right? They had what at that time was the most compute power you could imagine a corporation having, and they kept it in their own building, right? And it was theirs, and they managed every aspect of it in a closet. And the history of computing for the next 75 years in the Defense Industrial Base is moving more and more of that into abstractions, into the cloud, moving it, those things, virtual machines, moving into platforms as a service, and moving everything else to more and more as a service. So what we think the future of this industry is that all of that administrative burden and technical complexity of things like CMMC is going to be managed as a service moving into that cloud offering. And so you mentioned, Trent, our friends from Second Front are here. This is in a lot of ways their successful business model, is taking something incredibly complicated, a big barrier to entry for companies in order to do business with DoD, in order to serve the mission, and abstracting all that away and moving it into as a service. And so one of the things that Google is doing with companies like Trent or with Second Front is trying to take that complexity out and moving it into the as a service model. So company wants to have the ability to have the capabilities in Workspace natively that Trent's describing to secure not just the network, but the data itself. We want to make that easily available to them as an API service. And it's the same idea, but the difficulty of selling your product and your service to DoD, we want to take all that complexity out, and that's one of the great things that Second Front and companies like that do. And so that's really the future of software-defined warfare, is going to be helping the defense and industrial-based companies do the things that they're uniquely good at doing and taking the IT complexity and the cybersecurity complexity out of it. And I think KBOS is amazing for that, again, specifically because they're providing it as an API, which is an incredibly fluid, flexible, modular way of offering the technology, just like you heard from that guy that came up to your booth at RSA. It's a really great approach.
Thanks, Josh. That's great. Governor, I believe you just came back from the Czech Republic, where you were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Czech Republic entering into NATO with President Clinton. So just thinking about it thinking about basically intelligence sharing or data sharing or even collaboration abroad amongst allies through the prism of NATO, what do you see as like the biggest opportunity in regards to working more closely with our allies, as well as the biggest challenge in regards to how we're working with them at present? And do you envision that Cocoon Data could potentially help unlock those opportunities?
I don't want to make today political. The biggest challenge, make sure Trump doesn't get elected president. But I will just say this, meeting all the NATO leaders when I was over there, they are terrified. And I've never seen world leaders talk the way they talked. But whatever, we're not going to make tonight overly political. But back to the data piece, the idea that with all of these NATO allies that we could have all of this information sharing, but certain elements of that information sharing would only be for certain countries, for certain bits of information that they needed to know that other allies may not know without causing the undue problems that we normally have would be, that's why, I'm so excited about this. Certain countries should know certain things. Other NATO countries probably don't need to know something. And the instantaneous movement of information to the people who need to know it and not worried about it getting into the hands of even allies who it may have caused a problem for our intelligence defense community, I think that's what I'm really excited about. People do love the United States of America. Let me be crystal clear.
I'm with you.
Okay.
And I'm probably with you on the political point, but
Right.
So I think we have one more, maybe time for one more question. And I think we're going to leave it to Trent because I see glasses getting empty and I don't like that look. But Trent, thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you to the Cocoon team for pulling this all together. This is amazing. I love seeing friendly faces in the crowd. But do you have any final thoughts as to what are practical examples of how we can advance efforts for deeper integration in diplomatic and cross-functional platforms in sensitive data, or I'm trying to think of like joint exercises like Talisman Sabre, or even tech collaboration through things like AUKUS? What are some practical examples of how we might be able to deploy Cocoon Data in that environment?
Yeah, I was having the Google team and Josh and that, we've talked about this, but the Talisman's it's a biannual exercise down in the Pacific, so it's Australia, right? It's the US, the fleets, Singapore and Japan. Now, Singapore and Japan and South Korea are not part of, not only AUKUS, they're not even part of what's known as the Five Eyes, which is Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US and the UK in terms of intelligence sharing. So now you're going to go down there and you're going to get on an exercise together. The US has enough problems sharing information within its own platforms, within Navy, from the sky to the ships across the, let alone then saying, well, how are we going to share the information with the Aussies or the South Koreans? Nobody's thought about a new standard and how you share data around securely. And when Josh and I first started talking about this, mate, it's going to come up to nearly 2 years. You realise that? You've had a child who's now 1 year old. He's been born into this whole thing. You know, it's extraordinary. But we have to look at it differently, right? We have to work out how to share information. We're not going to win the next generation of conflict. We want peace. We don't want war, right? But in order to achieve that, we have to share. We're going to have to create spheres or elements of trust for a moment in time. As you said, Terry, you know, for that moment in time, not everybody needs to know everything, but you need to know enough to be able to work together in these environments. And I think what I love about what we're doing with, and again, shout out to the Google public sector team, they're really being a pioneer. They're jumping well ahead of what everybody else is doing. They're not just trying to compete with, say, AWS or Microsoft in there. They're saying, well, let's jump it forward to the next generation, and working with companies like us. So that's how we're going to win. That's how we're going to do better. That's how we're going to make AUKUS real, right? Not just a signing ceremony on board a battleship.
I think you should give a round of applause to Google. Let's give them a round of applause.
Yeah.
And I think they ought to move all their operations to Virginia.
Yeah, all of them. Thank you, guys. Let's please, we have a minimum, so please go ahead.